Well, hello! After my last video, I got some comments asking for a recipe for sourdough bread and also how to make a starter from scratch. So for my next two videos, I'll be doing exactly that. I want to start this video with a big disclaimer that this is not the perfect sourdough bread recipe. There are a lot of sourdough recipes and techniques out there that are probably more authentic and may even yield better results. But I've done a lot of experimenting and I've tried those techniques and I find a lot of them don't really help that much. So this recipe cuts the time-consuming steps out, but still allows you to make a really awesome loaf of bread. That said, if you make sourdough yourself and have any tips, please let me know, because I've only been making sourdough for about 6 months and I'm always looking to improve my recipe. Okay, so my bread baking process can be broken down into 5 steps and takes 24 hours from start to finish. But remember that the vast majority of that time is hands-off fermentation time. The actual hands-on portion is only about an hour and a half. The 5 steps are feeding your starter, mixing and kneading your dough, putting it on the counter to proof, shaping it and then doing the fridge proof, and then baking. To do all of this, you'll need a sourdough starter, flour, water, salt, a food scale, and optionally a banneton, or just a bowl covered in a towel, a lame, or just a sharp knife, and a Dutch oven, or just a big pot. I bake sourdough around 2 or maybe 3 times a week. That means for the majority of the time, except on baking days, I keep my starter in the fridge. But in the morning when I want to bake a loaf of bread, I take my starter out and I feed it. I'll go into more detail into sourdough feeding in my next video, but generally I just dump out a little, add some room temperature water and enough flour to get it to the consistency that I like. I then just let this sit on my counter, which is around 21 to 23 degrees Celsius, until the evening. Around 5 or 5:30 p.m. I move on to step 2, where I mix and knead the dough. The sourdough recipe I use is as follows: 400 grams all-purpose flour, 6 grams of salt, 160 grams of your risen sourdough starter, and 230 grams of room temperature water. Mix the flour and salt together, then add your now risen sourdough starter and water, mix with a spoon until roughly combined, and then pour onto a clean, unfloured surface to start kneading. You want to knead the dough for around 10 minutes. There are 2 kneading techniques that I generally use: the fold method, as I'm calling it, and the spread method. The fold method consists of folding the dough over itself, pushing down, and then rotating 90 degrees and repeating the process. This is the most common technique that I see in other recipes, but I find that it can create kind of a tight dough and can take longer than this other very technical technique that I do. This spread method involves just taking the dough and spreading it out before gathering it up, rotating it, and repeating. I find that doing this results in a much softer dough with trapped air inside and makes for a better final loaf of bread. After I see the dough go from a floppy mess that falls apart when you stretch it to something much softer and elastic, it's time for step 3. I form the dough into a little ball and put it back into the bowl I mixed everything in before covering it and allowing it to rise on the counter. I think 4 hours at a temperature of around 21 to 23 degrees Celsius is a pretty good rule of thumb for this stage. But if you live in a hotter climate, then 2 or 3 might be enough. And if you live somewhere cooler, then you might need 5 or even more. The best thing I can suggest is to start with 4 the first time and then start experimenting. You'll find that after you make a couple of loaves of bread, the whole process becomes much simpler and every step is a lot more intuitive. 4 hours later, or 3 or 5, and it's time for step 4. This is a pretty low hydration recipe. The amount of water relative to the amount of flour isn't very high. This means that working with and shaping the dough is pretty easy. The first thing you need to do is generously flour a banneton, or just a bowl covered in a towel. Then pour your now risen dough onto the counter, remember, no flour, and then pull it towards you to tighten the surface of the dough. This is a really satisfying feeling and probably my favorite part of the process. After you're feeling happy with the shape of the dough, pick it up and put it topside down into the banneton, or whatever you have. Then cover it with a towel and put it in the fridge overnight. The next morning, ideally more than 10 hours after you put the dough in the fridge, put your Dutch oven in the oven and preheat to 475 degrees Fahrenheit. After it's preheated, take the formed, risen loaf out of the fridge. You'll notice it's puffed up a bit since you've put it in, and it's also stiffer and cooler and easier to work with. Pour the loaf out of its basket and onto a towel. Then, take a sharp knife, I use a lame, which is just a razor blade with a fancy handle, and score the bread in whatever pattern inspires you. I've gotten in the habit of making a big, pretty deep X with 4 extra little scores just for fun. Then, take out the hot Dutch oven, put in the scored loaf, cover it, and then put it in the oven, still at 475, for 20 minutes. After 20 minutes, take off the lid and bake, still at 475, for another 17 minutes. I know 17 is a weird number, but it works well, I promise. After all that, wait 15 minutes before cutting into the loaf. It can be a little gummy if you cut into it too quickly, so trust me, it's worth the wait. And there you go. Like I said earlier, if you have any suggestions for things I can do to improve this recipe, please let me know in the comments. Also, thank you so much for the support on my first video. And thanks to my dad, who shared it on his channel, Travels with Jordy. No beer or word of the week yet, but we'll see where this goes. You'll see the starter video next week, if all goes to plan, and the kombucha one after that. Thanks again for watching, and see you soon.